Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Backer, and welcome to Write Better Stories. Neither of my birds will be joining me today because they were very annoying when I was trying to make this video earlier today. So, I saw a movie last night called Under the Silver Lake, and before I even saw it, just by watching the trailer, I could tell that this movie was going to be right up my alley. There's a guy trying to uncover a conspiracy. He goes on this noir-like mystery and this hunt to find this girl who has disappeared, and he's also projecting patterns all around him and trying to decode symbols that may or may not mean anything. So this is very similar to the work of Thomas Pynchon, who is one of my favorite authors. I've made several videos about his work here on my channel, and I think it was pretty obvious that the writer-director of this, the same guy who made It Follows, whose name escapes me right now because I'm not really good at remembering the names of directors, he was obviously inspired by Thomas Pynchon. It is so similar to a lot of Thomas Pynchon's work, specifically Inherent Vice, that you could almost call it derivative. Now, I do think that it's different enough to still make this worth seeing, and it's a very well-told and well-directed movie. I don't think it's a perfect movie, though, so I'll sort of get into my issues with it a little bit later, but just to talk about the good parts, one of the best parts of this movie is this device that the director uses in order to piece all of the very disparate and crazy scenes together. Now, this is a device that I think is used in a lot of noir and a lot of like symbol decoding movies, where basically you have a character in one scene who's talking to this one guy doing this one thing, and then they go to another scene that's seemingly unrelated, seems to be different, but then a symbol from one of the previous scenes or just a unclear phenomena from one of the other scenes ends up coming back, and it ties the two seemingly unrelated scenes together. Now, this is the dominant mode of tying all of these scenes together in Under the Silver Lake, so I think you could argue that it was maybe overutilized in this film, but this is a pretty good way to tie together some of your like crazy, more disparate scenes as a writer. And so, just to give an example, one of the symbols that he sees after this girl ends up moving out mysteriously in the middle of the night and goes missing, he sees a symbol that's like two diamonds next to each other on the wall, and then later in the film, this ends up being painted on his own wall. There you go. So like, those scenes were not necessarily connected, and you could almost guess that as a writer, the guy who made this movie wrote two completely different scenes and then just connected them with the symbol. And since the movie is about this guy trying to decode symbols throughout the film and understand patterns that may or may not be there, this is a really good way to give him the opportunity to do that character action, but also for the audience members to be sitting there and trying to decode and understand if there's any meaning there after all. And that ultimately ends up being what this film is about, looking for meaning that may or may not be there. And this is a really fun theme to play with, and it's, I think, a pretty good way to get into the interior of a character as opposed to any sort of exterior character action. Yeah, just the entire philosophy of somebody looking at something and trying to extract meaning from it, which is a hallmark of the postmodern genre. And I think one of the reasons that this comes up so much in postmodern fiction and postmodern films is that it's a very grounded way to show a very abstract philosophical concept that I refer to as correlationism. I'm not the only one to refer to it as this, but this is something that has come up through philosophy all through the ages. I think that like since even before the Greeks, maybe, I don't know, I'm not that good at the history of philosophy, but correlationism is basically the concept that we don't have access to the world itself. We only have access to the correlate of the world itself and the way that we perceive it. So, for example, I am actually not looking at the camera right now. The camera is actually just a perception of mine, and my understanding of a camera can't really be divorced from the fact that I am perceiving it. Everything that we know and have access to is mitigated by our perceptual faculties. So that is sort of an abstract thing, and it is so ubiquitous in all of our human understanding that it can be so subtle that we ignore it. But having somebody decoding symbols and not understanding if they are projecting that meaning there through some sort of paranoia, or if it actually does have meaning, is a very grounded way to show this idea. And so I think Thomas Pynchon does pull this off in a lot more of a delicate way, in a more assertive way, whereas in Under the Silver Lake, Andrew Garfield's character basically just is seeing these patterns everywhere, and it's almost as though we are just left to wonder whether there is any larger meaning to everything, where it seems like Thomas Pynchon will deconstruct the fact that we might be projecting meaning, but then assert some sort of larger meaning on top of it. Now, I think you could argue in a lot of Thomas Pynchon's work that this larger thing that he's asserting is also something that we could just deconstruct as something that is victim to our perceptual faculties. But I think in a lot of cases we do get this grand perspective of Thomas Pynchon. For example, in Inherent Vice, which is all about Doc trying to find this girl and basically solve this mystery, and he sees all of these patterns and these symbols that may or may not mean anything, even though a lot of this is deconstructed to just be his projections of his stoned and drug-addled mind. We still do get like a lot of thematic assertion about what it means to own people, because we have everything with Mickey Wolfman, who's the real estate owner, and he talks about how he woke up from his hippie dream and he realized that he was selling something that should have been free, which is thematically intertwined with the idea that Doc can't get over this girl from his past who he feels that he owns in a certain extent, and obviously people are free, you can't own people. And ultimately that movie ends up drawing the comparison between people coming in and out of each other's lives like rotating planets, that you don't ever really own anyone or have them as your private property. It's more that they come into your orbit and you guys are close for a while, but you might eventually orbit out of each other's orbit. So within Under the Silver Lake, it's playing with a very similar plot and theme, but I don't know if it really gives you any larger, broader point about people coming in and out of each other's lives. We basically get Andrew Garfield looking up at a billboard at several points throughout the film at this woman, and you don't really find out who she is until closer to the end of the movie, where it's revealed that this is a woman that he used to date who is now getting married to somebody else. I think this would have been a little bit more powerful had this been closer to the beginning of the movie. However, I do get the point that it was introduced later in the movie just as another phenomena that he is trying to extract meaning from. But this one actually did have meaning to him, whereas a lot of the other patterns don't. So the reason that I think that it might have been better placed at the beginning of the movie was that this ultimately ends up being the emotional arc that he goes through, is that he is chasing one woman throughout the film, apparently can't get over another one, and then in the last shot of the movie he ends up having sex with, or at least becoming intimate with, the old topless lady that was introduced at the beginning of the film, and I'll get to that in a moment. So since it does end up sort of solving this interior problem that he had, it would have made more sense to understand that that was his interior problem to begin with, or at least introduce and make us wonder about that. Whereas Inherent Vice, the opening scene of the movie, we get that Doc used to be with Shasta, who comes by to engage him in this mystery, and so even though it isn't explicitly stated that he can't get over her, we get that the mystery and her have a lot to do with each other. Whereas this, it's almost like his entire character arc was introduced so late in the film, and this is something that is allowed in other films, but it becomes muddled. So let me give you an example. Some films are just about people making decisive character actions and then coming to a greater, larger understanding of themselves by doing actions that have consequences. However, some films, I think specifically short films, but features definitely do this too, it's not that the character reaches a better understanding about themselves in the moment, but they get a better understanding about something that's happened in the past. This is sort of what Under the Silver Lake does, but it's not explicit enough to make it worth it to reveal this thing happening at the end of the movie, or near the end of the movie, that he's pining after this girl that he can't get over, especially considering that he's chasing like another girl from that he'd only met at this one point. So I would say one of the most negative things that I could say about this movie is that there's just like too many threads to really make it worth it. And I get the defense that maybe the director was just trying to show how overloaded he was with teaming significance that may or may not actually mean anything, and that there were so many different threads that the character was trying to juggle. But again, as a viewer, it doesn't really give you enough to chew on by the end of it. Now, I still think that it wasn't completely this nihilistic assertion that nothing means anything and meaning is only projected onto everything around it. And I think that is because of the way the movie ends, with him becoming intimate with this older woman who's like topless in every scene of the movie. Because one of the opening shots of the movie, after we see Andrew Garfield go into this like, I think it's like a fast food joint, is that he's on his balcony and he's spying on this topless older woman who's like loving her birds. She's being very loving and she has all these parrots around her, and she's like cradling them close to herself, and he's spying on her. But then the woman who ends up going missing is this like hot younger girl in a bikini who ends up like playing her radio with her dog next to the pool, and he sort of like shifts back and forth between them. Now, this could be totally meaningless, but since it is so early on in the film, and this film does seem to be so concerned with meaning and how we interpret images, I am tempted to think that this is a bit of a thematic statement about what Andrew Garfield as a character might be choosing as he goes throughout this film. Because he does end up becoming intimate with this older woman who is very available to him, and not necessarily that she's presenting herself as available specifically to him, but she's literally topless. This seems to be this sort of, consensual and open display of her sexuality that that is just like completely on display for everybody to see, whereas the other girl, the hot younger one who goes missing, by virtue of the fact that she goes missing, she is unavailable, and he like chases her anyway. So I think in some ways the like tension that he has as a character is that he is looking for love from people from people that can't really give it to him, when there might be available love right in front of him that is available to him. And to me, this is what also connects to this theme of the dog killer that ends up being, I think, a little bit lost throughout the course of the film. But basically there's this guy or girl, but I would assume a guy for explanations that exceed the purview of this video, who's going around like killing dogs. And this just, I think at first look, does appear to be just another thread, another crazy thing that may or may not have to do with the grand conspiracy that's evolving around him. But thematically, toward the end of the film, they do connect the idea of dogs to unconditional love, which is basically what Andrew Garfield wants as a character, but he's seeking it from people that can't really provide it to him. And so I would say that overall this is a fun movie that hits a lot of the fun noir genre elements pretty well. However, it does get a little bit lost in its own complexity, which, again, you could argue that was the point. It's not supposed to be clear. But since I have seen movies like, say, Inherent Vice and The Big Lebowski that approach similarly complex films with all of these different threads, but do give you a clearer ending and do give you a more clear thematic statement at the end, this is why I think Under the Silver Lake is not a perfect film. It's still very enjoyable and worth seeing. I would say, just to conclude, more than anything, I would like to assert that this is not a meaningless film. I don't think that the director is just trying to say, whoa, like everything's crazy, right? You can't make sense of anything. Because the last scene does seem to give you something. That he does end up becoming intimate with this older woman, and it isn't 100% clear what this might mean, but it does seem to mean something, at least to him. So now there are alarms going off behind me, which I think is a great cue to end this video. I hope that some of the details I shared in this video can help you write better stories, including my birds. All right, goodbye.